Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our far-flung participants. I'm Stewart Patrick. I'm Director of the Global Order and Institutions Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event on the UN Summit for the Future, What to Expect. This coming week, world leaders will convene, as always, for the annual opening of the UN General Assembly, and the centerpiece of this year's event will be grandly titled the Summit of the Future. According to Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to retrofit the UN and the broader multilateral system so that they are fit for purpose. This year's summit is supposed to come up with an outcome document, which is called the Pact for the Future. It's meant to serve as a blueprint for global institutional reform in the months and years ahead. The world is, after all, a very different place than the one that diplomats inhabited nearly 80 years ago, when they gathered just a mile away from where I'm speaking at the leafy estate of Dumbarton Oaks in Georgetown to negotiate what would become the UN Charter. It's also very different from the world that existed when diplomats this month were gathering for 80 years ago in Dumbarton Oaks, New Hampshire, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to negotiate what would become the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The summit next week is a really ambitious undertaking, and diplomats are going down to the wire, negotiating furiously over the recently dropped fourth revision to this document. Our event today is going to try to address several questions. First, what's the rationale for this summit? What are the main problems that we're seeking to address here? Second, does it make sense to hold this summit today about the future in a world that's racked by grave crises in the here and now? Is it likely to meet the moment and to help cure what ails us? Third, what do we know about the contents of the pact that's emerging? Where are member states in alignment, and where have fissures and flashpoints developed? Fourth, what, if anything, do the negotiations of the pact reveal about the world we live in? And then finally, what can be done to help ensure that these high-minded aspirations and the statements that are made are translated into concrete action? To help us answer these questions and more, we're honored to be joined today by three of the world's leading experts in the United Nations and multilateral affairs. Anne-Marie Slaughter is president of New America, a former director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, and importantly for our purposes, she recently served as a member of the UN Secretary-General's high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, which helped develop many of the ideas informing the summit. Richard Gowan is UN Director at Crisis Group and a knowledgeable and prolific commentator on United Nations affairs. He has particular interest in multilateral diplomacy on the Security Council, including in matters of peace and security and peacekeeping. My colleague Minh-Thu Pham is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment and head of Project Starling, which helps mobilize multi-stakeholder coalitions to drive concrete institutional reforms that improve multilateral cooperation, including at the United Nations. All of the speakers I should mention are good friends of mine. That said, we'll do our best to avoid groupthink and to try to be both provocative and entertaining. I'll ask each of our speakers some tailored questions, but I'll invite them to interject as needed for more of a free-flowing conversation. Towards the end of this call, we'll also hear from a special guest, Ambassador Axel Marschik, who serves as the permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations. Ambassador Marschik has been intimately involved in efforts to reform and increase the accountability of the UN Security Council to its broader membership. And he's going to give us an overview of some of those components of the pact. We'll try to reserve at least 10 minutes or so for questions for those on the call. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the YouTube chat for this event. Let me start with Anne-Marie. As I intimated, you've seen this process unfold over the last few years and indeed helped influence the contours of this week's gathering and the document that's being discussed as a member of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism. When you look at the summit and the pact as they seem to be unfolding, is this what you and your H-Lab colleagues had in mind? Are you satisfied with the scale of ambition that we're seeing here?
So, Stewart, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be able to participate on this panel with other panelists whom I always learn from, even when I don't agree, although we do agree a lot of the time. Let me start the answer to your question by just putting this summit in larger context. So the idea for this summit starts with Secretary Guterres's agenda for our common agenda, which was a report that he issued in 2021. It really reflected a major intellectual and policy statement by the Secretariat as to what the UN needed to go forward effectively. And he called for much more inclusive. And that word we're going to hear a lot. And I do think there we are seeing a high level of ambition, a much more inclusive networked multilateralism. Now, networked multilateralism, it's a phrase close to my heart. I've written about networks since 1994. It had a couple of meanings in that context. One was bringing together the many far-flung parts of the UN system and integrating the proliferation of agencies at the global level, regional. That is something that I think all systems need periodically to do. But he also meant including non-state actors. He has a whole section in our common agenda about bringing together organizations like the International Crisis Group, organizations like Mercy Corps, or any of the big 8 humanitarian organizations, but also corporations. How are you going to address the challenges of the digital world without tech companies, or climate without oil companies? That part was much more controversial. So I'll just say that was his idea in 2021. I don't think you're seeing very much about that today. But he said at the end of it, he was going to create a high-level advisory board on, and this is important, global public goods. Because the other thing that he paid a lot of attention to was what he called global public goods, which were those things that the world very much needs, but that we cannot do alone. The idea was a stable climate, a much more prepared health system for global pandemics, a digital ecosystem that would provide both equality and safety. He called those global public goods, and really I think his vision was this is where the UN has to go in this century. It has to create these global public goods. I would say the IMF and the World Bank are global public goods. They were created along with other organizations in the last century. He wanted a high-level advisory board to talk about how can we get there. Well, by the time it was created, global public goods was not in the title. It became effective multilateralism. We kind of finessed that by saying effective multilateralism are those global governance arrangements that can deliver global public goods. But that's really important because it told you right away that there were some very important states, certainly China among them, that did not like the framing of global public goods and creating global public goods. Because a global public good also implies global public financing, among other things, but it also says, we're committing to collaborate in a closer way. And again, he had the vision of non-state actors and state actors combining. By the time we got to the high-level panel, and it was 12 of us, it was co-chaired by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and former Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven. We were 12 people. For Americans listening in particular, I want you to imagine I am one American in a room full of people that reflect the global population. There were 4 Asians, there were 3 Africans, there were 2 Americans, one North American and one South American, a Brazilian representative. There were 2 Europeans and 1 Middle Easterner. That's important because when you bring the world together in New York these weeks, the United States and Europe are very much the global minority in population. And really in terms of global impact, where we need that impact. We worked very hard for a year and a half. I think the title of our report was A Breakthrough for People and Planet. And we did focus on Security Council reform, UN reform more broadly. We emphasized that not only did the Security Council need to be far more inclusive and representative, but also, as one of our principles for effective multilateralism, we said, majorities have to be able to outvote minorities, which is a radical statement, and you are not seeing a lot of that right now. But we also talked about overhauling the global financial institutions, creating a pact, which I think we will see for global governance of a digital ecosystem, and creating a pact for people and planet, advancing the Paris Agreement, not only on climate, but also things like biodiversity, and plastics pollution broadly. So it's a very ambitious report. We will hear from both Richard and Minh-Thu about how much of that is being realized. I will say that we knew that our job in part was to raise the ambition. That if you think about the Atlantic Charter back in 1943 versus the UN Charter in 1945, you need that sort of vision of what an effective global governance system could look like. We're never going to have global government, but we need to make a lot of changes in global governance to basically meet the global challenges we face. We learned a lot from one another and came out with a report I think we were proud of after a lot of hard bargaining, but it's always going to be watered down when you get to the States.
Thank you so much, Emery. A couple of reflections. One of them is that this is a summit of and a pact for the future. So even though some of the ideas were left on the cutting room floor, as they say in Hollywood, that doesn't mean that they're always going to be there, and that those ideas that you have seeded aren't going to be revisited in the future. I was also interested in your comments about non-state actors. Obviously, I know that there are lots of differences among UN member states as to how much civil society actors, and this is particularly a division that falls between sort of open societies and closed societies, as to whether or not they should be granted access to sort of the corridors of power and the corridors of influence in the United Nations, partly on sovereignty grounds and the notion that this is an intergovernmental organization. Yes. So there's only really one provision. There's only one paragraph, as I see it, in the entire of 58 different actions in the Pact for the future that includes that. And then the last thing that I would say, which comes out very strongly in your remarks, is that this was intended from the get-go as reforming the multilateral system and not simply the United Nations.
Exactly.
That again undoubtedly raises some hackles here and there and questions about competencies of different organizations, but we'll get into that. Minh-Thu, let's dive more deeply, if we can, into the drafting process for the Pact, and then hit in some of the areas of convergence and divergence we've seen. As many of you on this call will know, the Pact itself begins with a hortatory chapeau, and then it has 5 separate sections on sustainable development and development finance, on international peace and security, on science, technology, and innovation, on youth and future generations, and then on global institutional reform. In addition, the Pact is supposed to be accompanied by 2 annexes on a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations. But Minh-Thu, you don't have to be totally comprehensive. This is a 30-page document that's quite dense, but can you briefly walk us through any of the sections you think are particularly interesting in terms of where there are flashpoints or some disagreements that you've seen, and also conceivably some convergence?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Stewart, and really great to be here with old friends. So let me start with the positives, because I do think there is a lot in this document, in the Pact for the Future, that we can celebrate. I think despite global divisions, despite the war in Ukraine and what's going on in the Middle East, and our inability to address some of the fundamentals around climate and development, we are seeing some pretty good outcomes in this document. I'd say that this ambition, some of the ambition that Anne-Marie just laid out, is reflected in this document. We have a commitment for safeguarding the needs and interests of future generations, which I think really helps us to lay the groundwork for how we might think about our obligations today relating to climate and the environment, as well as peace and security issues. There is a commitment for working together on new and emerging technologies. Now, the details of that are still being worked out, But I think, we see these trends playing out where governments are struggling to keep up with emerging technologies, and the fact that the UN is bringing governments across the board together with very different philosophies on how you govern technology, and the benefits and risks of that. But the fact that there are governments coming together to try to deal with that, I think is a really positive sign. And those are some of the global public goods and bads that Anne-Marie just discussed. On issues around representation and voice, right now we are in a transition in the global order. And I think there are a lot of countries that are feeling emboldened. And I think some of those fault lines you're starting to see in this discussion. So maybe just to get really concrete on your question on what are the areas where there are some fissures or divisions, I'll just start with climate, because I think that is a threat that we all are trying to get a handle on. And when Anne-Marie talks about global public goods and effective multilateralism, there's almost no issue right now where we need to work together more on than climate change. And for a long time, so the first draft of this mentioned the COP language on phasing out fossil fuels. I think over the last few months, you've seen that language removed. And just in recent weeks, that's been added back in part because of the work of some Nobel laureates to say you can't have something called a Pact for the Future without mentioning one of the most urgent needs, which is to phase out the use of fossil fuels. So that's now back in the document. But climate and climate finance, adaptation finance is an incredibly difficult sticking point. In part also the process issues. Do we deal with this in the COP process or in something that heads of state are going to sign? Secondly, nuclear weapons and disarmament. That is quite a controversial issue. A lot of governments around the world really wanting us to work towards eliminating nuclear weapons. And so I think some of those discussions are playing out, the kind of nuclear weapon states versus others. And those that are non-nuclear weapon states really trying to step up and change that discussion. I'd say the probably the stickiest point is the reform of the international financial architecture. This is essentially just laying bare the divisions between the global South and the global North. And there is now an empowered global South, a sort of group of 77 in China, and others that are saying we are fed up with having to ask for greater access to finance, better quality finance, especially as we're seeing just recently COVID, climate, conflict, and the inability of these governments to be able to get to access the finance they need to support and develop their own populations. And so there is quite a bit of controversy, as you can imagine, around representation, around the kinds of details that the UN can and should get into when it comes to talking about the financial architecture and some of the issues around that. That I think is probably one of the main sticking points here. Other issues, you have your traditional challenges around human rights and gender. A lot of that is cultural. Some of that is reaching a sort of a heightened point, in part because of, I think, the greater cultural divisions between societies about, as you mentioned, open societies versus closed societies, and how they tackle human rights and gender, and how those issues then are reflected in technology and other things. Security Council reform and expansion, we can go into that a little bit more. I know you will, and I'm sure Richard can speak to this, but that has been, I think, an area where a lot of people around the world say, you look to the UN, you look at Ukraine or Gaza or some of these other things, and you think, if the UN can't handle that, what good is it? And so there was an impetus for us to figure out Security Council reform. And I think against all expectations, we are seeing some positive movement around that. And I'll let my colleague Richard speak more to that. Lastly, I think, this document really lays out, I think, this transition that I just spoke about in the world and global governance. There are a lot of countries around the world that are feeling the brunt of the global crises, and yet don't have the space or the voice to be able to address those for themselves. And so they are trying to take those issues, especially around finance, and bringing it into a UN forum where they have the numbers. They are the global majority. They have the numbers to secure the outcomes that they want. And that is really, I think, the divisions that you're seeing, such that now we're less than a week out from the Summit of the Future. Heads of state are on their way, flying to New York, and they're about to gather. And yet we don't have an agreed pact for the future. We don't have the annexes the Declaration of Future Generations, the Global Digital Compact. But I don't think that all hope is lost. I actually think it just highlights how much some of these countries are willing to play chicken in a way to get to a better outcome that really, I think, meets the expectations around the world. And so, you're seeing governments saying, hang on, is multilateralism here just for our own interests? And how willing are we to let the entire thing collapse because we're trying to hold on to our own sense of, what we have power over? Or how much are we willing to give up so that we can set ourselves on a course for greater cooperation? And that's really the sticking point that you're seeing right now.
Superb, Minh-Thu. Just one comment, and then I'll have a follow-up question. One comment on the global financial architecture. As you noted, there seems to be a pretty big divergence here on, at least on details, not least between the OECD countries, the sort of wealthy Western market democracies on the one hand, and then global South, global majority countries. It seems to me that some G77 countries aspire to move the decision-making on global economic governance from, in a sense, the Bretton Woods institutions to the UN General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC. But the West tends to be resistant to that, and not least because, of course, it enjoys quite significant weighted voting rights within those institutions. So some of it is a question of sort of venue. But I think that, the countries in the global South have been quite smart in saying, look, this is a gathering of heads of state. If this isn't a venue to talk about this, then what is? So I think just putting that pressure on and seeing more impetus for things like, UN Global Taxation Treaty and things like that coming from the UN itself, as opposed to coming from the OECD, is actually kind of an interesting development. Minh-Thu, I can't resist saying, you were heavily involved in the last major UN reform effort on the staff of Kofi Annan in Gulp 19 years ago or so. I
still have scars, Stewart. Are you trying to open
file?
She was a child. That's true. That's right. It was right out of high school, I'm sure. But no, it ages all of us. But these things come and go, right? I mean, there are certain secretaries general who have great ambitions, vaulting ambitions, and want to leave their mark on things. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how the context today, in a sense, contrasts with back in 2005. In all the turbulence that was going on. We live in a turbulent era now, but we certainly were in one there too. But how do the landscape and challenges and possibilities look to you? Just a few words on that would be great.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. Thanks for reopening old wounds. Actually, I think that in a way there are similar undertones, but in a way it's completely different. So similar in that at the time in 2005, it was just after the Iraq War, and you can imagine back then, and the global divisions. And yet at the time, the U.S. was, was a global hegemon, and was able to throw its weight around. And that discussion around the World Summit outcome in 2005 was about how much is the U.S. willing to constrain its own behavior for the greater good. Whereas now, I think, the world is in transition and governments do feel really emboldened. The other thing is that this agenda for the Summit of the Future is vastly more broad and encompasses way more issues than the 2005 World Summit. I mean, even then, we were talking about Security Council reform. We actually did make some progress. It was probably the last time we made any progress on that. But most of the reforms were about the UN, were centered on peace building at the UN, or the human rights apparatus at the UN, or even some basic management reforms around the UN in the aftermath of the oil for food crisis. So those, it was relatively narrow, whereas here you're really looking at the broad agenda. And so I think one lesson is that you can turn crisis into opportunity, and that sometimes the urgency of global crises pushes you to maybe agreeing on more things than you would have otherwise. And I think, a lot of diplomats will say things may be going bad right now, but there can be a shift very suddenly where then all the pieces fall in line, and then we get something actually quite good that we can be proud of. And so I think we're going to see in the next few days, hopefully, that moment. But then secondly, and just to this other point about global finance and the competency of various forums and venues, I actually don't think the global South or the G77 are looking for the UN to be the key and only decision maker on finance issues. I think what they're saying is that in the UN, it is, and especially in a gathering of heads of state, you can send a really clear political signal that this is what the global majority wants, so that then those decisions can be made in the other places, the G20, the G7 countries, or the multilateral development banks, but that it is informed by what the rest of the world is saying. And really, that's kind of my sense is what they really want. I mean, obviously, would their desire be that they get to have the say over what percentage of SDR, special drawing rights, or those kinds of things? I think, yeah, maybe, but at the end of the day, I think what they really want is to send that political signal so that their needs can be met in the right places, because the urgency of getting finance where you need it is even more is really needed. So thanks for that.
Thanks so much, Minh-Thu. Richard, it's safe to say nobody watches the dynamics of UN negotiations, so particularly at the Security Council, more closely than you do. I would love to get your take on how these multilateral negotiations are playing out against geopolitical and perhaps geoeconomic splits and grievances. Are the biggest tensions here sort of east-west, north-south, or something else? And then maybe more provocatively, do you regard the summit and the Pact as relevant to the major crises and choices and dilemmas the world faces today, such as Gaza, Ukraine, or as some might see it, as a colossal distraction? I guess another way of asking this, is whether or not the world needs a summit on the present rather than a summit for the future, or was the former simply too difficult to contemplate? Talking about the future sounds a little bit better than trying to deal with the world we actually are living in. But I realize that's a highly cynical framing. But I'd love to get. It seems curmudgeonly, which made me think of you.
No.
It was said with love.
It's always great when someone says you watch the UN more closely than anyone else, and is the UN a waste of time? I mean, it does make me wonder about my career choices. Look, I think in the short term, there is a very clear distinction between ongoing debates over Ukraine and Gaza and some other conflicts on the UN agenda, and then the discussions of the Summit of the Future. The two have essentially been kept apart as far as possible. And in addition to the summit next week, we're going to see a lot of meetings around the UN focusing on the Israel-Hamas war. We're going to see a special Security Council meeting again on Ukraine. There's also going to be a lot of discussions about Sudan, which is a third crisis that is increasingly consuming time and attention at the UN. But that's all pretty much separate to the summit process. And I think there was an understanding from fairly early on in the summit process that it could deliver some progress on questions like Security Council reform or strengthening UN peacekeeping, but it wasn't the right platform to deal with the burning issues of the moment. And in fact, to make any progress on all of the topics that Anne-Marie and Minh-Thu have described, diplomats really did have to keep everything apart, because if they had been allowed to merge into one single argument, we would have absolutely nothing to talk about today. There was a moment in late 2023 when it did feel as if the war in Gaza would derail the summit process. I remember one Arab diplomat saying to me, how can I talk about the future when Palestinian kids and Ukrainian kids may not live to see tomorrow? But I think there was a conscious decision by all parties in early 2024 to sort of keep these issues apart. And actually, I think Minh-Thu pointed to this, there was also a recognition that we really need some good news out of the UN right now. Because if you follow the UN in the media, you basically just hear about vetoes and failures and very little progress on the big crises of the day. So diplomats did come to start forward and say, let's try and use the Summit of the Future as a platform to show that we can still cooperate. And let's also see if we can open up some areas for cooperation that have not got much attention before, such as the digital economy and AI. And I think that sort of desire for cooperation, that desire for a win, has run through all the negotiations, even though there have been a lot of times when the negotiations have been extremely hard. And you've been talking about the rise of the global south as an actor at the UN. That's definitely something we're seeing. But it's worth saying that there have been quite big divisions within the so-called global south about how to approach the summit. There have been some hardline countries, Pakistan, Cuba, who have wanted to adopt a very confrontational approach to the West. But there's actually been quite a large caucus of other G77 countries, including a lot of small states, less developed countries, who have taken a very pragmatic approach from the get-go. And they have said precisely, look, we're not going to get to September and suddenly have the US and Europeans agree to the technicalities of World Bank reform in New York. That's never going to happen. But we can use this as a moment to build some bridges with the Western group, identify common ground with the Western group, especially around development, and use that as a platform for working together in future. And yes, as Minh-Thu said, we're now in the last week. We still don't have a pact. Countries have until 5 p.m. today to raise their objections to the latest draft. A lot of diplomats had a really rubbish weekend. I went to the basketball, which was a better choice. But we will get a document. And I think, that is not all that Antonio Guterres had hoped for in 2021, but it's a wide-ranging document. It contains a lot of interesting hooks for future policy processes. It's not a bad outcome, and it is a timely boost because, again, this week we're going to be having a huge argument in the General Assembly about the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, and that will be dragging everyone down. So we also need to have some discussions that lift us up a little.
Richard, can you say a little bit about the Russian role and level of enthusiasm for this exercise? And you mentioned some countries that are, in a sense, playing a bit of a spoiler role within the G77. Have you been surprised by Russian behavior or in the way that it's engaging this process, or?
Look, the Russian level of enthusiasm for this process is somewhere between nil and -1. And Russian officials have been very open throughout the process that they are skeptical of its value. They have some specific concerns. They made it clear, starting with the day that Guterres released our common agenda in 2021, that they didn't like the fact that it referred to nuclear weapons. And they have been consistent in arguing that the UN should not attempt to sort of get more involved in arms control. Now, actually, I have to say that I think quite a lot of other nuclear weapon states have been quietly in the background going like, thanks, Russia, thanks for going out there and saying this. But the Russians have been very firm on that. And I think that one area where we're going to see a debate even in the coming days is what language there is in the Pact about the need for nuclear disarmament, because it's still not where Moscow would like it. More generally, Russia has an interest in a status quo UN. Russia has some strong privileges embedded in the UN Charter, including the veto in the Security Council. And Russia's vision of the UN is not Anne-Marie Slaughter's vision of the UN. It's very much based on old school state-to-state sovereignty-based negotiations. And I think the Russians are broadly keen to stop the slide towards a more flexible multi-actor UN system. So in the last couple of weeks, as we've been getting into the final straight of negotiations, the Russians have been very frank that they're not happy where this is going, and they've even said that they would be willing to block the whole pact if necessary. I don't think they're going to do that in the end, though, because they recognize that at the end of the day, that would alienate a lot of the countries that they really want to win over in the developing world, especially in regions like Africa. So they will threaten, they will draw red lines, but in the end, they will compromise. By the way, I would also say that one power that seemed quite skeptical towards this process for much of the year was the United States. And one of the main skeptical voices on IFI reform, on World Bank reform, was the US Treasury. And actually, the US Treasury has been as firm in its opposition to some innovations in the Pact as the Russians have been. So, all status quo powers have a certain interest in the status quo.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting under the peace and security chapter was there were some interesting references to not simply nuclear weapons, obviously, and that it was clear that there had been some line in, line out, back and forth on that section. But I was actually quite interested. There's quite forward leaning on particularly biological weapons. Actually, there's a couple of interesting segments there, and then also on measured language with respect to lethal autonomous weapons and other sort of technological revolutions that bear watching in the security field. We're going to hear from Ambassador Marshak later, but on the UN Security Council reform, I'd love to prod you on that, Richard. Obviously the difficulties of reforming the United Nations are most acute with respect to the Council. And yet the negotiators seem to at least have outlined a few principles that should inform the debate. But I want to put this in the context of sort of the shifting U.S. position and get your sense also of whether or not a very recent shift in U.S. position kind of matters at all. As you recall, 2 years ago, President Biden went to the UN and in his address from the podium said, broke new ground in saying that the United States, in addition to supporting sort of three of its usual suspects for permanent membership, that is Germany, Japan, and India, also supported permanent representation for Africa and for Latin America. And last Thursday, the U.S. UN envoy, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, got even more specific, committing the United States to supporting actually 2 members for Africa, although albeit without veto. And then a new elected state for small island states, for the cohort of small island states, and then a support for text-based negotiations within the UN General Assembly so that real options could be submitted for a vote, which a lot of enthusiasts of at least trying to get a breakthrough have been in favor, in part to be able to force those that have been more recalcitrant to actually lay their cards on the table. Do you think that by and large, I mean, none of this stuff is going to get solved at the summit, but do you think that moves some of the ball forward on UN Security Council reform, and does it complement things that you're seeing in the Pact?
Well, look, firstly, I should say that I think Anne-Marie was wanting to respond to something I said in my previous remarks.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, sure.
Probably tell me that I'm wrong, so she should be given space to do that in a moment. But look, I've worked on Security Council reform on and off for over a decade, and I want that part of my life back. There has been so little progress on Council reform since the 2005 World Summit. It's been very frustrating. And to be quite honest, when we were coming into this year, my instinct was, the Summit of the Future process is not going to really deliver anything new. And I was wrong, because actually, through the discussions that Ambassador Marshak and his Kuwaiti counterpart have led, which he will describe more, member states have come to a certain set of parameters about what a more serious Council reform discussion would look like, including issues such as the need to give Africa greater voice in the Council. Now, there are still big gaps, not least, sort of hard questions about putting firm limits on the veto. These are still really difficult issues. China is still there in the background, very skeptical of Council reform because it worries about India and Japan getting permanent seats. But nonetheless, I think in diplomatic terms, this was probably the area where we made most progress that we didn't really expect. Why is that? Well, lots of smart diplomacy. The ambassador can tell us more about it. But I think it's also simply because, there is no one out there who can look at the Security Council right now and say, oh, well, that's working great. If you're the US looking at Ukraine, if you're Russia and China looking at Gaza, if you're anyone looking at Sudan, you see a body that isn't working. And I think we have perhaps just started to reach a bit of a conceptual tipping point where even the current permanent members of the Council genuinely recognize that the status quo is not sustainable, because otherwise it's just going to go back to what it was in 1959, where the Council didn't meet for 4 months. because it's just becoming incrementally more useless.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, yes, please. If there are things that Richard had previously mentioned or that have come up that you would love to chime in on, please do so.
So more comments, questions than disagreements. And honestly, I was never as involved as you were, but I did spend quite a bit of time in the aughts pushing for new permanent members, and India, Japan, Germany, and what I remember is when I became director of policy planning in the State Department, the first people who showed up at my office door were Pakistan, terrified that maybe India would get it, Italy, absolutely not for Germany, and Mexico, because of course Brazil should never. So it was, at that point you sort of thought, even if everybody wants reform, trying to agree on new permanent members, even without the veto, versus simply expanding. I'm with you on that I just thought this is never going to get resolved. But I had two sort of comment questions. One was, I would have said until now that in some ways, U.S. support for Security Council reform was the flip of what you just described Russia doing on nukes. In other words, we could push really hard because we knew that Russia and China did not want it. And we were putting them in an awkward position because by not wanting it, they were having to alienate their G77 friends to the extent that particularly China, but also Russia, will paint itself as the champion of what the developing world or the global majority. And I wonder to what extent that's changed, that the U.S., that they can't count on that kind of pushback, or at least not openly. And I'd love to know what you think about that. And the other was, and to you and to Minh-Thu, one thing we focused on in the high-level advisory board was what you might call sequential security. So that when the Security Council is blocked, then it goes to the UN. So obviously the veto initiative is a great example where now the Security Council has to at least explain why it vetoed. But we really thought, look, if they're not going to decide, then either you go to regional organizations, which the US has always liked because we have a bunch of them in our pocket, or you go to the General Assembly. And I'd love to hear from both of you whether that's something you see real movement on. Sorry, Stewart, it's not my business to pose questions. But
No, those were great, and they were actually on my list. So in terms of the veto initiative and uniting for peace and
all that stuff,
yeah.
Well, maybe I'll just quickly chime in and say that's one of the areas of progress in this document too. When you look at bright spots, it's there's a reference to the General Assembly having a role in these kinds of issues, revitalizing the work of the General Assembly and making sure that that there are active efforts for the Security Council to consult with the General Assembly on these issues. And I think they realize that creates greater buy-in, and that these efforts around Uniting for Peace and the veto initiative, which are explicitly mentioned in the last draft, are recognized as a way to do that. So I think there's progress there.
And as a footnote to that, just a couple of weeks ago, the President of the General Assembly released a new report looking at what the Assembly can do on peace and security issues, which is just a report, but nonetheless, it was something that was mandated by General Assembly members who had become frustrated with lack of action in the Council. So we are, I think we are seeing gradual steps towards the Assembly becoming more assertive on security matters. And yeah, I think, Anne-Marie, Council reform, when it comes to China, Russia, and the US, it is a bit like that scene at the end of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where you have the three gunslingers watching each other, wondering who's going to shoot first. And I think
a great image.
When I'm not going to say which is which, but when the US is willing to go this far on things like giving Africa more seats in the Security Council, I think the Chinese and the Russians feel that they do have to respond, because no one wants to be the the ultimate spoiler at a time when 188 other countries, to a greater or lesser extent, say that some sort of change is needed, even if they can't agree on what the change is.
It's interesting in that regard. It also puts not only China and Russia in the hot seat, but it also sort of puts the feet to the fire of the African Union in some degree, because of course the African Union has been, I wouldn't want to say hiding behind it, but has a quite developed and rather forward-leaning perspective called the Ezewini Consensus in terms of 2 permanent members with veto and 3 additional elected members in an expanded council. But of course, there's been very little movement on precisely which of those 2 elected members, permanent countries would actually be permanent members of the Security Council. So that obviously creates, one would think, some dynamics to at least or some pressure to begin to address that lacuna. One of the things that there's been a couple of things that Secretary-General Guterres has pushed that, in a sense, could be seen as sort of pet projects of his, and it was certainly in our common agenda and some of the policy briefs by the United Nations that helped support this. And one of the policy briefs was basically devoted to the notion of an emergency platform. And the idea here is that Guterres was going to create a mechanism to address complex global issues, such as presumably, a massive pandemic or some sort of just enormous natural disaster, or some cataclysmic event. They then would allow him or whoever Secretary General to set up a mechanism to be able to deal with this. There was a watered down version of that in the 3rd revision of the Pact, but it seems to have disappeared entirely in this 4th revision. And I guess I'm wondering, maybe starting with you, Richard, did UN member states want to remind the Secretary General that he's more secretary than general, or was this a question of sovereignty concerns, or a question of replicating existing mechanisms like the Security Council or humanitarian, mechanisms that already exist and already have mandates to actually do these things? Do you have a sense of why that might have disappeared?
I think Minh-Thu may be better placed to comment on that particular disappearance. A lot of diplomats all the way through the process have said, yes, the idea of coordination is good, but they've questioned whether you really need a new formal set of protocols to facilitate that coordination. I also think that there has been a certain sense that, this was the Secretary General saying that in a big crisis, he should be king of the world. And I'm not sure that a lot of member states really wanted to fully endorse that idea. But I think Minh-Thu will know more about the details.
Maybe just to say, it is what you said, Stewart. I think there were concerns around mandates, around sovereignty, and around, what kinds of emergencies does this apply to? In the end, I think the member states essentially removing it and opining on something that I think a lot of folks who know about the division of labor between the Secretary General and the governance roles of the member states would say this is something the Secretary General could have under his, and really here it's only been his authority to do. And so they've removed it, but that doesn't mean that he can't then alert the world the next time there is a major crisis to say, here's what we need to do. Here's how we might come together to address it. And so in practical terms, it doesn't mean that there is no way for the UN to play a leadership role in bringing the actors together to address an emergency. But in terms of the authority, is he more secretary or more general? I think they did seem to say, on these things, you still need to come back and check with us. That said, there's a couple of other pet issues in there that the Secretary General did propose. For instance, a special envoy for future generations. Yeah. And that is now that was being discussed in the context of the Declaration on Future Generations. There were a lot of great groups out there that were pushing for a UN envoy for future generations. I was a chief of staff to a previous UN envoy, and these roles really are just what an envoy make of it. But it is fully within the authority of the Secretary General to decide to appoint an envoy. And here in the Declaration of Future Generations, at least the latest version, is that they're just pitching it to the Secretary General to decide if he wants to, or maybe a future female Secretary General to decide if she wants to appoint a UN envoy for future generations. And all they've done is take note of that proposal. And so in a sense, I think here, I think there's been over time an erosion of the authority of the Secretary General to be able to do the kinds of things that someone in that position should be doing. And in a way, I think this Secretary General has asked for backup from member states, in a way almost asking for permission from member states. And I think, be careful what you ask for, because you might get an answer you don't want, which is no. Or maybe the better answer is the member states say, actually, that's not our authority. You need to be the one to decide. And I think in both of these instances that happened.
Can you say a little bit more about the rationale behind an envoy for future generations? Because is it simply a question of, well, there are intergenerational justice implications of what we do today, just as there are sort of procedural and distributive justice aspects of what is going on? And was there a sense of what the activities of this envoy might entail?
I'm actually looking to Anne-Marie here because she's been such a thought leader on this topic.
So I think, again, if we want to be grand and speak to the moment that at least the Secretary General envisaged, the San Francisco 2, where we revised the charter, which we are not doing. But the hope here is that the Declaration on Future Generations can be an anchor in the way that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was in 1949. That 1948, I always mix it up with NATO, but 1948. Which, the Universal Declaration is just that. It's a universal declaration. It was achieved by a drafting committee. It had no binding status as treaty, but it was signed off on by all the states of the time. And then from there, it gave rise to more specific treaties. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights over several decades. And the aim here is, if you all commit to thinking about future generations and the need to safeguard them, that means at the very least an envoy or somebody in your own government or international civil society can say every time you're going to make a decision, well, have you taken account of what that means for future generations? I think of it as in the United States when you have an environmental impact statement, which doesn't actually force you to do anything, but you have to have an environmental impact statement. And when you release that, then lots of people mobilize and say, well, we can't possibly have that. So similarly here, this is soft law. This is maybe even softer than soft law. It's a declaration, but particularly if it is followed up by an envoy. And then I would say I would expect to see national envoys. Secretary Clinton appointed basically a special ambassador for youth. Ronan Farrow served that role. And Minh-Thu's right. It's always a function of what the personalities make of it. But if you imagine a number of important states, let's just say that all the G20 states, who then have their envoys meeting with the UN envoy, thinking about future generations and trying to implement parts of the declaration, that gradually gains weight in the push and pull of global negotiations.
Can I just ask about the Global Digital Compact? Is the rationale for that document primarily one of, in a sense, development, in the sense of trying to make sure that the digital divide that we've seen increasingly in our world is not perpetuated, and that's where some are increasingly getting the fruits and the benefits and are the locus of all sorts of inventions and sort of transformative impacts on their societies, and others are in a sense not used to or not in the position to actually make use of it? Or is this more about, well, let's control the dangerous technologies, digital technologies, or is it really about human rights and maintaining human rights in this new digital era? Or is it a little bit of all of the above? Richard, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I haven't followed the digital compact as closely as some other parts of the process. I mean, I think the area where it's easiest to get sort of consensus at the UN on digital issues right now is very much about how they relate to development, as you say. And I think if you look at the UN's membership, you have quite a lot of small, middle-sized states that don't have AI industries of their own, that would like there to be greater, greater cooperation, greater regulation of new tech through the UN. And then you have some big powers that do have major AI industries, like the US, who are very skeptical of that. So there have been moments on the digital compact, again, where it's been the US and its allies that have been pushing back against some of the more ambitious ideas. But I think what is interesting is that in the course of the last year, the Biden administration, China, they've recognized that they have to respond to this broader demand for some sort of greater international cooperation on digital issues. And so actually in the spring and summer, we saw the US table a General Assembly resolution on AI and development. The Chinese didn't want to be caught out, so they tabled a resolution. And this is one of the sort of strange bits of magic at the UN, which is lots of big powers who don't really want to do things sometimes actually feel that they probably do need to step up. They do need to accept some policy innovation because otherwise they're going to lose the goodwill of other members. And I think that looking forward, I would see the digital compact very much as Anne-Marie described the text on future generations. It's a starting point. And what it may have no impact or it may have great impact, depending on how willing states, but also tech companies and civil society are to pick it up and try and put flesh on the bones that have been negotiated so far.
That's a very interesting dynamic that you describe. Just should note that here at Carnegie, there are a number of my colleagues, and not least the folks working in Carnegie India, our center in India, have been very interested in digital public infrastructure, which the Indian government has been a pioneer at, and now has, I think, arrangements with some 40 different countries around the world to try to expand that and try to sort of create frameworks and infrastructures that don't, in the first instance, are not overly reliant on some of the big tech giants, and that provide things like mobile money and digital identities and things like that are, can be, the uptake can be remarkable, and the benefits and getting rid of the middlemen can be quite remarkable as well. And then just obviously there was another high level advisory body informing the Secretary-General. The high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence, and my understanding is that some of its work will be integrated into the Global Digital Compact, and part of the governance of AI going forward is, as you've said, seizing the development opportunities that are associated with that, while mitigating some of the obvious risks that people have cited. And apparently the French government, which has the next AI Safety Summit, or they're building it as the AI Opportunity Summit, is quite animated with trying to make sure that that whatever arrangements exist are ones that help advance development in the Global South, and including through the provision of compute and skills training and other types of resources. And there are a lot of different models that have been put out there, including one, which may be an imperfect one, sort of Gavi, or a Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunizations, a Gavi model for AI and development, sponsoring, using AI to harnessing it for development. We're about ready, I think, to turn to Ambassador Marshak. Ambassador Marshak, as I mentioned, is the permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations, has been spearheading much of the diplomacy on UN Security Council reform, including non-amendment avenues to improving the function and accountability of the Council, accountability to the broader UN membership. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to this event. Would love to hear your reflections on the Security Council components of the evolving pact. We've spent some time sort of walking around those and discussing different elements, but you have the front row seat in terms of how these negotiations have gone and how this helps push the debates over the role of the Security Council forward. So first of all, welcome to our program, and be delighted to hear anything you'd have to say.
Thank you so much, Stewart. Really appreciate being there and seeing these fabulous colleagues, these real experts on UN affairs. To be a party here is a real honor. Thanks so much. If I could maybe just add one comment to the whole Pact discussion. I think for us, or for many of us here at the UN, one of the key positive effects is that we seem to have, even in times when there's a lot of frustration with the UN, buy-in by the leaders of the 193 member states to continue using the UN to address the key challenges that we're facing with in the present, but also in the future. You just spoke about the digital compact, the fact that that this is an issue which makes enormous sense to look at from a global perspective rather than a fragmented regional perspective, is really key. That there is this continued buy-in into the UN, into the system where we all decide together to address these questions. So that in a way for us is a key positive takeaway from this happening. On Security Council reform, I think Richard said the key things. I think we had 8 months of very intense negotiation. It was a separate track, so all the 193 members met separately from the rest of the Pact discussions, specifically on the Security Council reform. And I think anyone who has followed that, even less, not necessarily as long as Richard, but for anyone who's followed it over the years, the expectations at the outset were extremely low. If you remember, Minh-Thu knows in 2005, at the end of the day, after big efforts, a small paragraph more or less remained, which stated that it's an important issue and we have to keep working on it. And this was more or less where we noticed that the majority had their expectations set. But at the same time, and also as Richard mentioned, we had the pressure of the daily visible failure of the Council over Ukraine and Gaza, combined with the frustrations that had been rising, especially in the Global South, over the past decades with the composition of the Council in a way that it does not reflect the composition of the wider membership of the UN. That combined to give or to amount to so much pressure that there was recognition by even those most reluctant among the member states regarding reform, that something has to move and something has to be done. And in a way, therefore, we were lucky that we had the Summit of the Future set up as a target, which added a deadline to the pressure. And therefore, I think made it possible that we actually got more out of this than I think anyone really thought at the beginning. And maybe just in one word, what do we have now? I think we have 3 actions. One action is a first since 1963, an agreement of the leaders of the UN on certain elements, certain principles on how the reform will look like. That, for the reform process, is a huge win, because these are things which have been debated every single year, and they can now be put aside, and they can say, look, we have an agreement on a couple of issues. And these are important things. A commitment that there will be more representation from developing countries. A commitment that there will be a discussion of limitations to the veto. And a commitment that there will be a review clause in it, and a review clause in the question of the Security Council reform, of course, is a very crucial thing. Also, a recognition of the special role that Africa would need in view of the many peace operations and missions and that deal with Africa. So all of these points are now agreed and therefore can be used in the future discussions as starting points, which do not, again, have to be re-established every single year. The second action regards the process. Here also, we now have a process. We had a huge fight all the time, is how do we get to a text that we can actually negotiate? And there was huge opposition against anyone putting forward a text of a resolution. But now we have an agreement on an action that the co-chairs will put together a consolidated model based on the models that are presented by the various states and groups over the past year. And that we have introduced this new possibility. And therefore, we now have an avenue along which we can move the Security Council reform along from a procedural perspective. And finally, the last action, Action 43 in the current draft, has interim measures which will apply while we wait for the reform to actually enter into force. And that, in a way, may be the most important action of all, because it is supposed to have immediate effect. And that regards quite important issues, like, for example, having impact on working methods, making the elected members' role more important vis-a-vis the permanent five. A commitment to fully implement Article 27.3. That's a very, very big commitment. We will see how that actually plays out in practice, because that is an article that says that parties to a dispute should not participate in a vote on a resolution. And then there is also language on moving forward with and making better use of Uniting for Peace and the veto initiative role for the General Assembly to step in when the Council is having difficulties. So, if you want, these are real ambitious goals that the states have adopted here in order to not waste time and wait for the reform to enter into force, but to start working together more effectively immediately.
Mr. Ambassador, that's a terrific overview and a very concise overview. I have a couple of one clarification and then one follow-up question. Just on your description of Article 27.3, just to add to what you said, in other words, enjoins Security Council members not to vote on a resolution in which they're a party, and this applies to Article 6 or Chapter 6, in other words, for the Pacific resolution of dispute. So it would not, in fact, say prevent Russia, for instance, from vetoing a Chapter 7 resolution on Ukraine. I did have a question about the process action, which is fascinating, that the co-chairs or the facilitators are able to pull together a consolidated model based on the models that are out there. Would this be a single model, or would this almost of necessity be a model with a couple of different options, as happened back in 2005, when the two models that were presented were in a sense very similar to the so-called G4 countries and then the United for Consensus countries? They were quite disparate. Or is it your hope or expectation that the model might actually be, in a sense, a single text that could be voted up or down within the UN General Assembly?
Well, I think the key difference to a resolution text and a consolidated model text is that the consolidated model, it is a bit unclear how that will look like textually. So it does not necessarily have to be something that can immediately go to a vote, but something that may still have to be put into a UN resolution, draft resolution type text in order to then actually be voted on. But I would, and again, it would also depend on the co-chairs, whoever is in the position then actually to put this consolidated model together, to decide exactly how that will look and whether they then include alternative versions or whether they maybe have one subpara looking one way and another subpara looking at and there's a possibility to choose. I think that's up to the future co-chairs. But in essence, it does indicate and imply that there should be one model based on the various models which have been presented. And I think we have seen over the past decades of negotiations that it is possible to come up with intermediate models and complicated constructions which manage to find a sweet spot between those who only want or who insist on having new permanent members and those who insist on not having new permanent members. It is possible to come up with something which is creative and in the middle, if you wish. But so far, neither side has wanted to actually do that. And this is the first time that we have an indication that maybe states, after all this negotiation time, might be ready to accept, to compromise.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for that. Do any of the other folks, panelists, Anne-Marie, you had a thought? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Mr. Marshak, first of all, thank you. I was taking fast notes. It was fascinating. I'm very interested in your final point there, because one of the questions I think from the audience is, what's the importance of regional organizations? And if I had to sort of map out a negotiating strategy or a possible strategy for moving this along, I would focus on not only the African Union, but the European Union. I have just reviewed a book manuscript by two very distinguished European EU and national officials, essentially saying if the EU wants to play a global role, it is going to have to figure out how to reduce its representation. Right? I mean, you have Britain and France. I mean, if they are the ultimate status quo powers, but in the end, of course, it's not just Germany, it's the whole EU. So you could imagine some kind of tacit intermediate deal. I mean, some intermediate way where for very different reasons, they both could say, well, maybe they name one and the other is a sort of regular member. But so I just wanted to add that, because we have not talked about France and Britain, and yet they are feeling the post-imperial or post-colonial heat, both within their countries and certainly from the rest of the world. And of course, the US has a stake there too. Of course, you're an Austrian, but
yes, I will be very careful in answering that specifically. But I think you have put your finger precisely on the big question, and I think that will, especially now after we have this agreement here, will be the big issue in the debate of the reform, the role of organizations and whether they may be the link in a way that, or the bridge that combines the permanent and the non-permanent seat discussions. The African model, we are waiting to see. It's supposed to be one of the next ones that comes. And here, because also it was mentioned, I think, Stewart, you mentioned it before, or Richard, I think that is extremely interesting to see what they will put forward in terms of details of how they plan on delivering the African permanent members. And it may well be that those are members that turn out to be just permanent in the context of a permanent African seat, but not necessarily on a national basis, and the possibility to switch them out, to replace them either through a procedure which is agreed on in advance. There's a sort of a regional rotation. So you have a permanent regional seat, but then you have rotation among the actual states who sit physically at the table, or some other model. We will find out, but I think it may also then of course, be applicable to other regions as well. And whether that then is the solution or whether that is complementary to other proposals, that of course will be then up to the negotiations to see.
Mr. Ambassador, that's first of all, that's fascinating, and what I'm reflecting in terms of some of the creativity that you and your colleagues have been able to inject into this, not least with respect to the UN General Assembly, ramping up its efforts to hold the UN Security Council accountable without, in this case, a charter amendment. It's reminiscent of, or it makes me think of, long frozen, sea ice, and then suddenly there's starting to be cracks appearing and new possibilities and configurations emerging. So I'm not sure if you're, Amundsen or some other polar explorer who can help us guide us through this, but I really appreciate it, and I also am very appreciative of my three friends and colleagues, Richard, Minh-Thu, and Anne-Marie, for joining on this call. We're unfortunately out of time. Mr. Ambassador, I imagine you have a busy week ahead. There's a suspicion that you'll be called on to perform many duties, and I hope that this next week or 2 weeks go very well for you. For all of you joining the call, really delighted that you were able to participate and listen to what my fellow speakers had to say. And we'll look forward to you joining us on future such events. But anyway, that brings to a close this formal meeting. So thank you again. Thanks so much.